In a mail cycle that has now lasted into a third decade, a participation statement leaves a Sony office and lands in the life of a writer. It concerns Men in Black, the 1997 Columbia release that turned black suits and a neuralizer into global furniture. The document does not enclose a backend check. It reports that the picture, on the books that matter to his contract, is still unprofitable. One reporting cycle, covered by Film Stories and Film Buff Online, put the latest annual haul at $5 million. The movie had already taken in $589 million at the worldwide box office. The production budget had been published at about $90 million. Ordinary arithmetic would call that a windfall. Studio arithmetic does not. This is the cold precision of a defined term. Net profit is not a feeling in a theater. It is a residue after a private sequence of charges. Sony Pictures can absorb cash from tickets, television licenses, discs, and later digital windows. Sony Rappaport is still teaching. It still has Manhattan to which they can be delivered. It still manages its central catalog. It still inventories all those composers. It still keeps all the ingredients. It is still doing all that. While all those years, the check hasn't come. It's not just Mikey. It's an academic problem. It's something to write a textbook on. The GW textbook has grown over the years. It's gotten longer. It's even gotten larger. It's gotten bigger. It's gotten better. It's gotten more money. 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 It's never been the same. It's never changed. 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 It's never textbook.
The film entity can remain, legally, a loser. The parent is not required to pretend the cash never existed. It is required only to apply the contract. Ed Solomon wrote the screenplay. His deal included a slice of that residue. The residue never forms. Year after year, the statement arrives like a weather report from a climate that cannot warm. Sequels can mint new money under new titles. The original ledger can stay underwater. Audiences remember a #1 summer. Executives remember a franchise. The contract remembers a deficit. The contradiction the rest of this story has to open is simple, and it is not a conspiracy theory. A hit can generate enormous cash flow for a parent company and still fail, on purpose of structure rather than accident of taste, to reach net profit. The mechanisms have names, they have percentages, they have a history older than the movie, and they explain why a writer can be told, decades after the world paid, that the picture is still not a success. Open the statement and the hit recedes.
Close it and the posters remain. A title either fills seats or it does not. Trade papers print a weekend gross. A few months later, they print a worldwide total. That number becomes the public moral of the story. Hit or miss, winner or turkey. The blind spot sits one layer beneath the marquee. The studio is not one party. It is at least two. One face finances and owns the negative.
The other face distributes the finished film to theaters, broadcasters, and retailers. Those faces can share a lobby, a logo, and a parent in Tokyo or New York, and still invoice each other as if they were strangers. The production is often parked in a single picture company, a thin legal shell created to borrow the budget, hold the copyright for a time, and wear every cost the distributor chooses to assign. The shell does not control the pipeline that turns tickets into cash. The distributor does. After 1948, when the Paramount consent decrees forced the old majors to separate exhibition from production, distribution hardened into the durable profit center. Theaters were no longer house organs. They became counterparties that kept a large cut of the box office, often near half, sometimes more in early weeks, sometimes less in a long run. What returned to the studio was not the headline gross, it was film rental. That rental, not the poster number, became the first real input on the private ledger. From there, the distributor charged a fee for the privilege of selling the film it already owned. 30% has been a common theatrical rate.
Home entertainment, television, and foreign territories have carried their own schedules, sometimes higher. The fee is income to the parent and a cost to the picture. A second habit arrived with the package unit era of the 1970s, when studios stopped keeping armies of contract talent on weekly salary and began assembling each film as a temporary coalition. Writers, directors, and some producers were offered net profit participations in place of richer upfront money. The points looked like partnership. They were cheap to grant because they sat at the end of a waterfall almost nobody was expected to reach. In 1988, Paramount released Coming to America. Eddie Murphy filled theaters. The picture became one of the year's commercial pillars. Art Buchwald had a story credit claim and a net profit deal. Paramount's statement said there was no net. Buchwald sued. In 1990, a California court looked at the formula and called parts of it unconscionable. The case did not abolish the waterfall. It published it.
A few years later, Winston Groom watched Forrest Gump become a cultural weather system and learned how little a novelist's net points could mean beside a star's better contract. Home video added another wrinkle that civilians almost never see. For years, many studio contracts treated only a fraction of cassette and disc wholesale as film revenue, often around 20%, as if the rest were an unrelated manufacturing business. The movie could saturate every rental shop in America and still deposit a sliver into the pot that net participants were waiting on. Advertising worked in the opposite direction. Prints and ads were charged in full, then frequently marked with an overhead percentage, so the campaign that made the hit also deepened the hole the hit was supposed to fill. Interest began on day one, levied on the negative cost, as if the shell had taken a bank loan, except the bank was the studio, and the rate did not behave like a loan you could refinance at a credit union. By 1989, when Sony bought Columbia Pictures, this contract culture was already mature. The electronics giant did not invent the two-face studio. It inherited a language in which unprofitable did not mean the corporation missed payroll. It meant a defined bucket stayed empty. 8 years later, a comic book comedy about secret agents would walk into that language as a finished object, already wearing the clauses that decide who gets paid after the applause. He had already put Bill and Ted on screen, a comedy voice sharp enough to get him the assignment of turning Lowell Cunningham's obscure comic into a summer machine for Columbia. A writer of his standing in the mid-90s could command a fee. He could not command the private air force that stars use to rewrite the waterfall. So the deal did what writer deals have done for half a century. It paid him to type, then offered him a percentage of whatever remained after everyone with more leverage had eaten. That percentage is not greed on his part. It is the industry's substitute for equity. Accept it, and you are told you will share in success. Decline it, and you leave money on a table that may never exist. Sony's motive is cleaner than villainy. A public parent wants cash flow, library value, sequel options, and merchandise that can live in another column. It wants the right to spend heavily on prints, ads, and talent without turning every hit into an open-ended partnership with every person who touched Draft 3. Internal charges keep the surplus inside the family. They also keep the definition of success on a page the family writes.
Barry Sonnenfeld, hired to direct, and producers Walter F. Parks and Laurie MacDonald, standing near the Amblin Current that had already taught Hollywood how to industrialize wonder, occupied different rungs. Some rungs come with producing fees, some with more protective definitions, some with relationships that survive a single title. Will Smith arrived after Independence Day had already turned him into a planetary opening weekend instrument. A star in that position can often demand money that is not residue at all, first dollar gross, a cut of theatrical rental before the net even begins to be calculated. Those dollars are real. They also become costs on the very statement a writer is waiting to see flip from red to black. The more the face on the poster is paid like an owner, the longer the people paid like residual claimants wait. That is not a morality play. It is a stacking order. Solomon's incentive is patience married to hope. Sony's incentive is to keep hope cheap. Between them sits a participation department, whose job is neither art nor fraud in the cartoon sense.
Its job is to apply the definitions until a summer phenomenon can be classified, without perjury, as a venture that has not yet broken even. The human stake is smaller than a bankruptcy and larger than a slight. A man who wrote a film the planet can quote is told by letterhead that the planet's money does not include him.
Production carries its own overhead, frequently 15% of the approved negative, a charge for executives, offices, and the abstract shelter of being inside a major. Interest begins before the premiere, attached to the money the shell supposedly borrowed to pay crew, sets, and the lead cast. The rate is not a favor, it compounds. Every month the picture remains in deficit, the deficit grows by the interest on the deficit, which already includes fees paid to the parent. This is why a year of healthy cash receipts can still print as a loss. New revenue arrives. New charges arrive faster, or interest on old charges eats the difference. Imagine a simplified engine, labeled as a typical structure rather than a leaked Sony line item. Negative cost, 100. Overhead, 15. Advertising, 50 plus 5. Distribution fees across windows, tens of millions more. Gross participations to a star or a powerful producer come out as costs, not as fellow net claims. Guild residuals, trailer bills, delivery costs, and taxes take their pieces. Break even is not a finish line painted on the ground.
It is a horizon that recedes when you walk toward it, because walking toward it generates the very charges that push it back. Accountants have a phrase for that chase: rolling break even. The picture can throw off cash for a quarter century and still fail to cross a line that moves. Home entertainment used to be the cruelest illustration. Living rooms minted a second fortune after the theatrical wave. Contracts often credited the film with a royalty slice and left the rest in a distribution or manufacturing pocket. Television licenses could be sold to sister channels at prices that were defensible as internal deals and disappointing as fuel for net. Later, digital bundles and subscription licenses repeat the old problem in a new socket. The parent negotiates with itself or with a platform, books a number, and the shell accepts that number as if it had bargained in an alley with a stranger. Cross-collateralization, when a contract allows it, can yoke one title's fate to prints, campaigns, or even sister films, so a success is asked to carry a stranger's weight. Sequels do not automatically rescue the first ledger. A new film is a new shell, a new set of fees, a new interest clock.
Franchise cash can light the parent's skyline while the original participation statement stays subterranean. That is the wound the annual envelope keeps open. Not that audiences stopped caring, that caring has been rerouted. In the decisive months of 1997, the campaign works. The movie opens on the 2nd of July. Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones own the weekend. The rental checks begin their march toward Culver City and the Sony system. The fee comes off first. Advertising lands like a second negative. Overhead sits on both. Interest, already running, does not pause to applaud. Somewhere in a later fiscal year, a writer's statement can show another multi-million-dollar descent, even as the library title keeps selling Halloween costumes and streaming thumbnails.
No courtroom scene is required for that descent to be legal. Buchwald's victory embarrassed a formula. It did not install a public utility commission over studio ledgers.
Most net participants never reach trial. They receive a packet, hire an auditor if they can afford one, argue a few categories, settle a slice, and watch the horizon move again. Audits themselves are bounded by contract. Limited years, limited access, limited definitions of what counts as a document. The studio's strongest position is not a secret vault. It is a clause that says the vault's inventory is whatever the clause says it is. First dollar gross becomes the only reliable escape hatch, and it is sold only to people who can shut down a start date by walking away. A writer waiting on net is not in that chair. He can be famous in the specific, painful way of someone whose sentences are quoted by strangers, while his backend remains a theoretical planet. The climax is not an explosion on a soundstage. It is a column that never changes color. Cash moves upstairs. The shell remains hungry.
The parent can tell the truth and still deny the royalty, because the truth it is telling is the truth of a private dictionary. And then the next statement prints. Points above the waterline. The larger principle is not that Hollywood lies for sport. It is that a familiar object can run on two parallel truths at once, and only one of those truths is allowed to write checks to the people who were promised a share. Cash flow is a fact you can feel in a corporate treasury. Net profit is a literary genre practiced by lawyers. When those two part company, the parting is not a glitch, it is the point of the paperwork. Talent with muscle has already voted with its riders. Agents now treat net points as costume jewelry, except for the powerless. The living demand is gross participation, adjusted gross, first dollar, a percentage harvested before the waterfall becomes a novel. That shift does not reform the ledger, it abandons it. Stars, a handful of directors, and a few producers climb above the waterline. Writers, novelists, and mid-power contributors remain below, holding tickets to a boat that was designed not to dock.
Streaming deepens the fog, because the old box office headline at least offered a public shadow of the private math. A license fee negotiated between cousins offers almost none. The same parent that once charged itself a distribution fee can now bury a title inside a subscription mound and assign it a value that will never look like 589 million of anything. The costume still hangs in the Museum of Popular Memory. Children still point at the tiny gun and the big gun. The contractual film, the one that lives in participation statements, can remain a distressed asset until the last clause expires. That is the aftertaste the channel keeps returning to in different rooms. A thing everyone thinks they understand, ruled by a document almost no one is invited to read. The parent company is not required to starve. The shell is not required to feast. Between them, a writer's old hope becomes a piece of mail. If a summer landmark can be cash-rich and profitless at the same time, by design rather than by accident, what other ordinary object in a life is already living on a ledger you will never be shown?